Hello and welcome to this Unified Communication Self-Training class GCS level. My name is Ilyas Namran and I am a Regional Product Engineer here at Grandstream EMEA, and I'm in charge of the Unified Communication and Collaboration solution. And in this class, we're going to learn about the best practices and the features that we offer in our UCM IPPBXs to keep it safe. So without further ado, let's get into this class. To protect the data that is stored and transmitted by the UCM, our developers have provided different mechanisms to repel several threats and attacks that can put the confidentiality of the sensitive data at risk of unauthorized access. In this class, we are going to learn about the aspects where protection is primordial in the UCM6000, and we'll explain each of the mechanisms in detail. Without further ado, here is the agenda for this class. So the first aspect that we're going to talk about is the HTTP server and login security. And then we're going to talk about extension on trunk security. Then we're going to talk about calls security, and then static and dynamic defense. Last but not least, fail to ban feature. And let's start with the HTTP server embedded in the UCM and how to protect its security. The UCM embedded web server responds to HTTP or HTTPS GET and POST requests. Embedded HTML pages allow users to configure the device through a web browser such as Microsoft Internet Explorer, Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, etc. With this, administrators can access and configure all available UCM information and settings. But before doing that, the security risks involved when placing the UCM on public networks need to be understood, and some security settings should be configured to avoid any vulnerabilities. By default, the UCM uses HTTPS for access, but it can be changed to HTTP, but we recommend using HTTPS over HTTP. By default, the UCM uses HTTPS for access, but it can be changed to HTTP, but we recommend using HTTPS over HTTP. And the port used for the HTTPS is 8089, and we recommend changing that to reinforce the security. What you should also note is that the password that you use in the first use of the UCM is the random and unique one printed on the sticker of the UCM. It can be found in the info menu on the LCD display of the UCM, but it is strongly recommended to change it once you access the UCM web interface during the Setup Wizard configuration. Users have the option to specify a list of up to 10 IP addresses which will be allowed to access the UCM web UI, and the addresses that are not listed will be restricted from accessing the UCM. This access restriction will help the admin to secure the UCM access from different IP addresses beside the whitelisted ones. Users have other options regarding the UCM access. For example, you can configure the UCM web interface to disconnect after a timeout of no activity on the web GUI. After the timeout, the UCM user should re-enter the credentials for his or her account to sign in again. You can also configure the number of logins attempts and limit it to a specific number. Once that number has been reached, the user will have to wait through a cooldown timer of 5 minutes until he or she can try again. You can also specify the ban period to wait after the user has been blocked. You can also configure this cooldown timer. And the second aspect that we're going to look at is the extension and trunk security. When creating a new SIP extension, for instance, the UCM administrator is required to configure SIP password, which will be used for account registration authentication, and there are some settings to consider when you need to secure your created extensions. If the option Enable Random Password has been enabled, SIP password is automatically filled with a randomly generated secure password when creating the extension on the UCM. And for Enforce Strong Password, it will require you to enter a strong password that should contain at least one number and at least one lowercase letter, uppercase letter, or special character. Also, the UCM administrator could control what IP address or addresses are allowed to register to a certain extension by editing strategy. As a UCM user, you should make sure to configure the strategy option to the smallest set to block registration attempts from anyone who doesn't need to register to the account. The strategy option can be set basically to 3 settings. First, you can allow register requests from local IPs only, and by default, the local subnet where the UCM is located is allowed. User could also add more local subnets where the devices are allowed to register to this extension. Secondly, you can allow register requests from one user-specified IP only. And finally, you allow registration requests from anywhere, which is not recommended. Rather than that, users can also assign permission level to users extension. The available permissions are internal, local, national, and international, from the lowest to the highest level. And the same level or higher than the outbound rules privilege is required to make outbound calls using this rule. Administrators must be extra careful when configuring trunks that will route long-distance or international calls. Only the intended extensions should be able to use this kind of trunks, otherwise the cost for the calls will be a significant loss if the trunk is used irresponsibly. Administrators can protect outbound rules with passwords that would be requested by the UCM when callers try to use the configured routes. Trunks also have 4 supported privilege levels, and they are internal, local, national, and international, and can be configured as privilege level from the trunk's outbound. And outbound calls through trunk can be placed only if the permission level assigned to the caller is higher or equal to the privilege level of the outbound rule. Outbound call requests from users with privilege lower than the outbound rule will be rejected. UCM administrators can also specify the extensions or extension groups that can use the outbound rule. This can be done by selecting extension or extensions group or defining pattern for the source caller ID. The extension allowed to make outbound call will either need to be an extension in the selected list or match the defined pattern. In the scenario where multiple users share the same phone and the phone is used to make the outbound calls, outbound routes can be set to require PIN entry to use. And next we are going to talk about calls security. To secure the calls and encrypt them, the UCM has the option to enable TLS encryption, allowing for safe transmission over untrusted networks with authenticated parties. And SIP endpoints will still need to be configured to use TLS to encrypt SIP messages sent to the UCM. And we have SRTP, which is disabled by default, and it can be enabled for the extension and trunk side for encrypted audio stream. SRTP can be enabled or forced, or enabled but not forced. The difference is the extension will support SRTP and will not allow any calls without it when forced, while it will allow negotiation with calls without SRTP when it is enabled but not forced. UCM supports a set of encryption algorithms for SRTP, which the user can select one of them to use to encrypt calls or select many algorithms that will be prioritized depending on their position in the list. And next, we're going to talk about static and dynamic defense. The UCM firewall functionality consists of 3 components: static defense, dynamic defense, and fail to ban. We're going to look at fail to ban in a different section. Each can be configured for a specific type of malicious attacks, and let's talk now about the static defense first. Static defense is one of the UCM firewall functionalities that use pre-configured filtering rules to protect the UCM. There are 3 filtering rule types supported. There is accept, reject, and drop a specific configured traffic. Accept will allow the traffic, reject will refuse the traffic, and drop will neglect the traffic. And of course, these rules can be applied to specific source destination IP addresses and ports. So basically, users can set rules to allow or deny the traffic from a specific interface, from LAN or the WAN interface, or from a specific service such as SFTP, SSH, Telnet, etc., and even the direction of the traffic, if it's outbound traffic or inbound traffic. These rules will help you avoid many malicious attacks in the future. Beside that, users also have some other features like ping defense, which will protect your UCM against ping floods by not responding to ICMP echo requests. SYN flood defense, which will protect against SYN floods by limiting the amount of SYN requests accepted per second. Ping of death defense, which protects against ping packets larger than 64 kilobytes. And next we're going to talk about dynamic defense, which protects the UCM by blacklisting individual hosts that send excessive connection attempts or brute force attacks. Dynamic defense can be configured to automatically blacklist hosts making massive connection attempts or brute force attacks to the UCM. Dynamic defense's connection threshold and blacklist update interval can be adjusted in accordance to administrator's preference, and whitelist entries can be added to prevent specific IP address or port from getting blocked. For example, if a host initiates more than 20 TCP connections to the UCM within 1 minute, it will be added into the UCM blacklist and will be blocked by the UCM for 500 seconds. While when a host is in the whitelist, if it initiates more than 20 TCP connections to the UCM within 1 minute, it will not be added into the UCM blacklist and it can still establish TCP connection with the UCM. And now we're going to talk about fail to ban. Fail to ban feature on the UCM provides intrusion detection and prevention for authentication errors in SIP register, invite, and subscribe. Once the entry is detected within max retry duration, the UCM will take action to forbid the host for a certain period configured by the administrator. This feature helps prevent SIP brute force attacks to the PBX system. The fail to ban defend also against hostile TCP and TLS attacks. When the number of registration attempts by an IP address exceeds the user-defined value, the address will be banned from accessing the UCM web portal, preventing further access attempts.